The college town was buzzing with the usual swarm of students scrambling to find a place to live. Marcos knew he had to act fast if he wanted to find an affordable apartment. His budget was tight, and sharing a space with noisy roommates wasn't an option. That's when he found the ad, apartment available, room 303. Affordable rent, mandatory rules. The price was way below the average. Too good to be true. But Marcos, short on time and even shorter on cash, decided to ignore his gut feeling and dial the number on the ad. A few hours later, he was standing in front of an old 3-story building that had clearly seen better days. The landlord, a thin man with tired features, greeted him with few words. "You sure you want to rent this room?" the man asked, lighting a cigarette. "Yeah." "Why?" The landlord exhaled a slow stream of smoke before replying. "The rules. Some people can't follow them." Marcos frowned. Rules? That was odd, but he was used to strange rules in student housing. Nothing he couldn't handle. "Don't worry. I'm pretty organized." The landlord gave a dry smile and handed him the keys. "The list is inside the room. Read it carefully." When Marcos stepped inside, he found a small but comfortable space. Basic furniture, a twin bed, an old wardrobe, and a desk. Sitting in the middle of the bed was a yellowed envelope with his name scrawled on it in shaky handwriting. Opening it, he found a piece of paper folded several times. The words were handwritten in uneven, trembling letters. 1. Lock the door 3 times before going to sleep. If you wake up and find it unlocked, pretend you're asleep. 2. Never look into the bathroom mirror after 2 a.m. If you hear your reflection whispering, ignore it. 3. If someone knocks on the door after midnight, don't open it, even if it's your own voice asking. 4. The closet must remain closed. If you find it open at dawn, leave the apartment immediately. 5. If you notice shadows under your bed, don't try to look at them directly. They feed on your attention. 6. The TV might turn on by itself at 3:33 a.m. If it does, don't try to turn it off. Just leave the room for 5 minutes. 7. If you wake up and the room is mirrored, furniture reversed, lie back down and don't get up until sunrise. The first night in room 303 was peaceful. Too peaceful. Marcos collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, barely paying attention to the list of rules. To him, it was nothing more than a silly prank from the previous tenant. Locking the door 3 times, avoiding the mirror, it all sounded like one of those creepy internet challenges. Still, just to be safe, he turned the key 3 times before switching off the light. Just in case. The second night, things got weird. Marcos woke up suddenly, for no apparent reason. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The clock read 2:47 a.m., and then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was knocking on the wall. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, coming from the right side of the room, where there was nothing but the wardrobe. He remembered the rules. If you hear knocking on the wall between 2 and 3 a.m., do not respond. Marcos stayed perfectly still, every muscle tense, trying to steady his breathing. Maybe it was a neighbor, but this was the last apartment at the end of the hall, and on the other side of that wall was nothing but empty space. Tap, tap, tap. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to ignore it. The knocking continued for a few more minutes before stopping. Sudden, absolute silence. He stayed awake until sunrise, convincing himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks. But then as he got up, he saw something that made his stomach twist. The wardrobe was open. Slowly, he moved closer and pushed the doors open fully. Nothing inside, just his clothes and bags. But something about it felt wrong, because he knew for a fact that he had closed that wardrobe before going to sleep. His eyes darted back to the list of rules. If you find it open at dawn, leave the apartment immediately. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Should he leave? That was ridiculous. He was being paranoid. Maybe he just forgot to close it properly. Yeah, that had to be it. He shoved the wardrobe doors shut, making sure they were completely closed. What he didn't see was a reflection in the bathroom mirror. Something was watching him from the other side of the room. Something that shouldn't be there. And it was smiling. Marco spent the entire day trying to shake off what had happened the night before. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe he was exhausted from the move. Still, that unsettling feeling of being watched refused to leave him. By late afternoon, he decided to get out of the apartment for a while. He wandered aimlessly through the city, stopping at a random diner to clear his head. When he returned to the building, the landlord was waiting in the lobby. "Sleep well?" the man asked, taking a drag from his cigarette. The question caught Marcos off guard. "Yeah, I guess. Why?" The landlord stared at him for a moment before exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "If I were you, I'd follow the rules." And with that, he turned and disappeared down the hallway. A chill ran down Marcos's spine. How did the landlord know about the rules? Was this some kind of sick prank the building pulled on new tenants? Shaking off the unease, he headed up to his apartment and locked the door behind him. "Enough of this crap," he muttered, tossing his backpack onto the floor. Sleep came quickly that night, but something woke him up. Something was wrong. His body was rigid, his breathing shallow. The room was dark, but he could feel it, a presence. Instinct told him not to open his eyes. Something was watching him. Slowly, his senses sharpened. The darkness felt heavier, as if it were swallowing the room whole. The distant hum of the city outside was muffled, like sound itself had been drained from the air. Then, the wardrobe door creaked open. A chill ran down his spine. He knew he shouldn't look. He repeated this to himself over and over. But he opened his eyes. Inside the wardrobe, in the thick blackness, something was standing there. He couldn't see it clearly, but the outline of a body was visible. Motionless, waiting, patient. His lungs refused to work. His whole body trembled. Then it moved. The figure inside the wardrobe tilted its head in an unnatural, jerky motion, as if studying Marcos. And then, slowly, it began to step forward. Fear locked him in place. It was dark, faceless, but the silhouette was familiar. It looked like him. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, but he couldn't move. The thing kept approaching, its steps dragging across the wooden floor. And then, a sound came from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking on the wall. The figure stopped in the middle of the room, its body tense, as if something had interrupted its advance. Tap, tap, tap. The knocks came again, louder this time. The thing snapped its head toward the wall, its neck cracking in the process. And then it vanished. Marcos gasped for air, his chest burning. His body finally obeyed him, and he scrambled out of bed, switching on every light in the room. The wardrobe was closed. Like nothing had ever happened. He was shaking. His breath came in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It had to be a dream, right? But then he noticed something. The knocking. It hadn't come from the wall. It had come from inside the mirror. In the following days, Marcos tried to rationalize everything. The wardrobe, the dark figure, the knocking. His brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress, a new city, new classes. His mind was just playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee in the tiny kitchen, Marcos noticed something strange. The envelope with the rules and a hidden diary. It was sitting there, placed right next to his plate, almost like someone had left it there on purpose. His hands trembled as he picked up the diary. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting frantic. scribbled as if the author had been writing in a state of pure distress. I warned you. The rules are not meant to be broken. The thing I saw, it was watching me. And now it's watching you. Marcos read the message over and over, his mind unraveling. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but the diary continued. If you're reading this, you've already broken the first rule. If you've heard the knocks and looked at the wardrobe, you've sealed your fate. Don't try to run. The entity won't let you. If you leave, it will follow you. And when the time comes, you'll be next. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the words in the diary or the overwhelming sensation that he was no longer alone. He flipped to the last page. A final note was scrawled in shaky, nearly illegible handwriting. The bathroom door doesn't fully close. Never go in there at night. The bathroom was right there, to his left. He had never noticed anything strange about it before, but now, the simple idea of stepping through that doorway made his skin crawl. He turned to look at it, really look at it, and now that he was paying attention, he saw it. The door wasn't perfectly aligned with the frame. A thin, dark gap stretched between the wood and the door frame. He took a deep breath and shut his eyes, trying to convince himself he was imagining things, that the fear was messing with his head. But he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. That dreadful, suffocating feeling of being watched. It was getting stronger, even now, even in broad daylight. Without thinking, Marcos grabbed his phone and started searching. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening. Lucio Soares. That was the name of the previous tenant. He found it buried in an old forum thread. An anonymous post from years ago describing a missing person who had once lived in room 303. I saw what he saw, and I saw what came after. Be careful with room 303. It's not just an apartment. It's a prison. Marcos swallowed hard, his fingers trembling. The phone slipped from his hands. He kept searching, clicking on every post he could find. But there was nothing except warnings. Stories from people who had stayed in room 303 and were never seen or heard from again. Then one comment made his blood run cold. You won't find anything about him. Nobody ever comes back. The connection hit him like a freight train. The previous tenant had vanished. And Marcos, he was already in danger. That night was worse. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt too loud. He followed the rules. Locked the door 3 times. Checked the wardrobe. Then lay down with his phone clutched in his hand. If something happened, he'd be ready. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. At 2:37 a.m., a sound woke him up. Not knocks. Not footsteps. A whisper, low, continuous, coming from the bathroom. His eyes flew open. He knew the rule. Never look at the mirror after 2 a.m. But what if the mirror was already looking at him? The whispering didn't stop. A low, incomprehensible murmur. Marcos's heart pounded so violently that he thought he might die right there. With every ounce of willpower, he turned his head toward the bathroom door. It was slightly open. A sliver of light from the hallway spilled in, casting a faint glow on the mirror. But the reflection, something was wrong with it. Marcos felt sheer panic crawl up his spine. A figure stood in the glass. Tall, thin, its edges blurred, like it was made of liquid shadows. It moved inside the mirror, slowly, until it stopped right next to the bed's reflection. In the real world, nothing was there, but in the mirror, the figure leaned in, closer. Marcos wanted to look away. He wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. Then the shadow stopped, and it turned its head toward him, directly at him. It knew he was looking. Marcos's blood ran cold as the thing's mouth stretched open, a grotesque, unnatural grin, teeth too long, too jagged, like claws waiting to tear into flesh. Panic took over. Without thinking, Marcos lunged for the nightstand. grabbing the lamp and hurling it at the mirror with everything he had. Crash! Glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. Silence. His chest heaved. His pulse raced. He waited. For a sound. For movement. For anything. But nothing came. Finally, he forced himself to look down at the broken shards scattered across the floor. And that's when he saw it. The reflection. It was still there. And it was smiling. His lungs fought for air. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in around him. Barefoot and trembling, he grabbed his phone and rushed to the door. His hands were sweating as he twisted the doorknob. The door wouldn't budge. Locked. But he hadn't locked it. Desperation set in. He twisted the knob harder. The wood creaked, but the door wouldn't give. Then he felt it. Behind him. The presence. It was in the room. A chill crawled over his entire body as he fought to resist the urge to look. He couldn't turn around. He kept telling himself mentally not to turn around. But then something moved on the floor. The shards of the mirror. They slid slowly, dragging across the wooden floor. The shards were forming a shape, the same shape from the reflection. His body froze, fear blending into irrational panic. He squeezed his eyes shut and muttered to himself, "This isn't happening. This isn't happening." A cold breeze brushed his neck. Something was close, so close that he could feel its breath, if it even breathed. And then the lights flickered. It was at that moment the door opened. Without hesitating, Marcos threw himself down the hallway, not daring to look back. He ran to the front desk, out of breath, feeling his heart race in his chest. The building manager was still there, sitting behind the counter, calmly taking a drag from a cigarette. When he saw Marcos, drenched in sweat and trembling, he raised just one eyebrow. "You look, don't you?" Marcos opened his mouth to respond, but he didn't know what to say. How did he know? How did everyone seem to know, except for him? The manager sighed and flicked the cigarette away. "You're already marked. No point in running." Marcos felt his stomach churn. The smile of the thing in the mirror was an impossible tear in the darkness. Marcos felt his body freeze, unable to look away. The figure was there, but he felt like it was no longer just a reflection. What is that?" The manager took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes empty, showing no surprise. "It's you. Or rather, it's what's going to replace you." Marcos's head was spinning. He looked at the mirror again, his heart pounding against his chest. And then Marcos felt something cold on his shoulder. His body reacted on its own. He spun on his heels, ready to face whatever it was. Nothing. The reception hall was empty, except for the building manager and his tired expression. But in the mirror, the thing was still there. And then, without warning, a silhouette in the reflection began to overlap with Marcos's image. Slowly, the dark edges started swallowing his reflection, replacing every detail with a twisted, wrong version. His eyes were the last to disappear. "I warned you," the building manager muttered. A snap echoed through the hall. The glass cracked from the inside out, creating a web of fissures that spread quickly. And then the mirror cut. The sound echoed like thunder. Pieces flew across the floor, scattering into thousands of shards. Marcos stumbled backward, breathing heavily, realizing something inside him had been ripped out. He looked around. Nothing. No shadows, no reflection. Nothing. For a moment, he thought he was free. But then, the building manager looked at him, shaking his head with a strange weight. "I'm sorry, kid, but it's over." Marcos furrowed his brow, not understanding. And then, finally, I understood. There were no more reflections. No glass at the reception desk. None of the shards on the floor. No glow from his phone screen. Marcos had no reflection anymore. His body froze. "What happened to me?" he whispered, his throat dry. The landlord stubbed out his cigarette and looked at the ground. "Someone always has to stay in the room. Now, you belong to it." The realization hit him, like an overwhelming weight. He no longer had a reflection because he had become the shadow. A new one would come. Someone would break the rules, and he would be there, waiting inside the mirror, just like the last tenant, just like all the others.